Hi, I'm Arit. I'm a member of Team UAE for 2025 to 2026, and today I'll be delivering a lecture on the fundamentals of rebuttal. So, firstly, I think it's important to address what is rebuttal. It's pretty obvious, but just to clarify, rebuttal is material that engages with something the other side has said during the round. So, for example, if you're second prop, you might want to respond to the argument that first op is given, and that response is what we call a rebuttal. But it's not just to arguments; it can be to clashes. It can even be to another rebuttal. So, if you're second prop and first op has responded to something that your first prop has said, a form of rebuttal is also responding to that and then helping build your first speaker's argument. Why is it important? And I think it's important for a few reasons, and it's important to appreciate how they can really affect a round. They can do two things, right? Firstly, like I hinted to earlier, they can strengthen your own argument. It's basically it's basically a guarantee that your major arguments in the round are going to get pushback from the other side. And it's important that you are able to push back at that pushing back in order to make sure that your argument is as strong as possible, and so the judge buys it. But it's also about weakening theirs because you don't debate in a vacuum. You're debating with another side presenting their own positive material. And so it's important that you make that positive material as weak as possible in order to make yours seem better in comparison. And I want to note here the importance of good rebuttal, right, within the debate. It can be the difference between a win and a loss. Judges love to see engagement. I obviously have done quite a bit of judging, and in that time judging, what I've noticed time and time again is that judges don't like to be interventionists. We are told as judges to only debate what we see in the round. And so if the other side has spent a lot of time weakening your argument, but you haven't really done anything to question theirs, they're probably going to win that debate by a pretty big margin. And so it's important to narrow down that margin as much as possible and reduce the margin for error in the judges call. But it's also to do with your own speaker scores, right? Like if you are a second speaker, the judges are going to want to see you do a lot of rebuttal and do a good amount of and a good quality of rebuttal. And so you shouldn't neglect it while prepping. While arguments are important, especially down the bench, rebuttals are equally as important because that's what makes up the engagement of the round. Judges aren't going to do that for you. Next, then, on how to structure a rebuttal. Again, this is fairly simple, but it's important that you get it right because it makes it makes the content that you're delivering that much more effective. Firstly, briefly remind everyone of what you're responding to. So if you're responding to an argument, like a broad argument, in one sentence, briefly remind us what that argument is. It's probably been about like 8 minutes since they said it. And so it's important to just remind everyone what you're talking about. It also just makes it a bit more clear. If it's a specific mech, then mention that specific mech or that specific impact again in one line. Don't go into this in too much depth because you're taking away time from your own speech. Then you give your responses, and I'll talk about this more on the next slide. But the third part is what I really want you to take away. Why does what you have said mattered? And this is the difference between a response and a rebuttal, because you can say a lot of things that attack an argument or rebuttal they've said, but until you've explained two things: one, why this takes down their argument, and two, why this is important for the debate as a whole, it doesn't really mean much in the round. So let's say you've responded to their biggest claim, and then you've explained, okay, this takes down their argument because we've shown that the mechs don't happen, and so they can't access the impacts, etc. Another part that's also important is saying, okay, look, we've taken down their biggest argument, so they really don't have a leg to stand on in terms of positive material. And so look at all the positive material we've given you. Clearly, we're winning the debate. It's also an important part of rebuttal from a strategic perspective, so the judge knows where what you're saying fits in within the broader debate. Next, then, just a little note: make sure to be structured and signpost wherever possible. So, for example, if you're giving three responses, you say, okay, the for the previous speaker said blah blah blah, three responses. Response one, blah blah blah. Response two, blah blah blah. Response three, blah blah blah. Why does this matter? Two reasons. Firstly, blah blah blah. Secondly, blah blah blah. It's important to keep that structure so we kind of know where you're going. If you're having responses, say, okay, I have three responses before I begin my speech. Response one, response two. The more structured you are, the easier it is to follow, the easier it is for the judge to track what you're saying on their paper, and that's what they'll take with them into the deliberation room. Next, then, on the types of rebuttal, there are quite a few, but I'm going to break them up into two parts. Firstly, what I would like to think like the standard kind of responses to utilitarian arguments, and then some of the more unique special cases. So, firstly, on the traditional types of rebuttal, the first one is, and I'll go from least to most effective. So, starting with mitigation. Mitigation just means that you're saying what they're talking about doesn't actually happen as much as they say it is, or isn't as impactful as they say it is. And I'm going to illustrate each one with an example. So with mitigation, take the motion this house would legalize all drugs. An argument could be on op that legalizing drugs would lead to an increase in drug use. Now, this is 100% true and logical, right? And you'd be wasting your time if you try to rebut it and say, no, this doesn't actually happen. People use less drugs when you legalize it. It's very difficult to do that. And so this is a case where you need to mitigate the argument and make it seem less impactful than it is. So for an example of mitigation in this case would be, well, realistically, not everyone is going to start taking drugs, right? And so the amount of people that this affects probably is marginal. But also the impact is probably marginal, right? Because not everyone is taking the most hardcore drugs like heroin. And so immediately you've restricted the scope of their argument significantly. And even though the premise is true, you've shown how it isn't actually that important in the round. This is where other engagement tactics like weighing come in. But this is the least effective kind of rebuttal because you still let the overall premise stand, and there is still some harm on their side of the house. So on their side of the house, there is still a marginal harm because some more people will take some hard drugs, and so it's kind of there, but it's not there as significantly as they said it was. Next, then, is neutralization. This is probably the most common one that you see, and the one that you will see coming up in the debate circuits when you're a beginner. This is basically saying the same broad thing, right? That this doesn't happen, or the impacts don't happen, or this is symmetrical. Basically, saying that the delta is zero on both sides of the house. So an example of neutralization is, let's say someone had a backlash argument, and the premises of this backlash is, this applies to like any motion with a backlash argument, and the premises were of the impacts were, one, people get mad at this thing. Two, people act on this madness, and then three, people do bad things by acting on the madness. Let's say we take premise two, right? That we want to neutralize premise two and say that it doesn't happen. You could say that it's something you can't be sure of this, right? Yes, people will get mad at things, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they will act on this madness. As tomorrow, something else will be happening that makes them mad, or they might lose focus, right? Like why are they so mad about this one thing that might make them act on it and make them act on it in a bad way? And so this is basically challenging the premise of the argument altogether and saying it doesn't happen. Finally, the flip, which is definitely the most effective form of rebuttal. This is when you're trying to say that what they're talking about happens more on your side, or is better on your side, or the opposite happens on their side. Note the words in bold, right? Because being comparative is really, really important here. The idea with the flip is that if you look at your impact like this, imagine this is like neutral, you're flipping it on the other side. And so what you're trying to do is trying to explain why your side is better. You're not considering their side in a vacuum anymore. And I'll give an example here, right? So let's take the motion, this house will impose mandatory voting. Prop might say that this is good because more people vote and this is good for democracy. A flip on the impacts here is saying, okay, yes, more people vote, but this is a bad thing for democracy. And so what you're doing is you're taking it from a positive impact to a negative one. And so you're flipping which side this argument works for. And you could explain this by saying, actually, when it's not necessarily good that more people vote, because some people will just come and vote for the sake of it. They'll do what's called donkey voting, and their vote doesn't really matter. It just dilutes the votes of people who actually try to research, or this might lead to more extremism, more populism, etc. But this is a flip, and you can see how it's the most effective, because if you're taking impacts as that bar again, mitigation only reduces the bar, neutralization puts the bar back to zero, but flip actually takes the bar the other way. And that's why you should try to go for the flip wherever possible. Now, obviously, you shouldn't go around trying to create flips when there isn't one, but wherever you can see a strong feasible flip, I think you should go for that. Another example where you're flipping the premise. So with social justice movements, right? One argument that one side may run is that whatever we're doing within our social justice movement is going to increase buy-in, and they're going to give you mechs for why this increases buy-in. The impacts here are not relevant. A flip in this case would be actually to say on the other side, oh no, actually, we're going to flip the premise and say the opposite happens. You get less buy-in, or we get more buy-in. But the important part here is not just to give a separate argument talking about why, oh, our thing gives us more buy-in, but our thing gives us buy-in, but to explain why your mechanism for buy-in is more significant than their mechanism for buy-in. And if you don't do that, then it's not a flip, it's just kind of an argument, and it doesn't deal with the crux of their argument. So it's important that you consider both in tandem. I would say when you're responding to these kind of traditional utilitarian arguments that you will probably see a lot when you're starting out in debate, is try to do at least one of each. And you would start with the flip and ending with mitigation. So again, using the structure, okay, so they said this, three responses. Firstly, I'm going to flip the argument altogether, and I'm going to flip the argument altogether and say that actually X impact happens on our side or X premise happens on our side, whatever, blah, blah, blah. But even if you don't buy that, we think that this just doesn't happen on their side, that this is symmetrical or whatever. And then you explain that and say, even if you buy that it happens on their side, we still don't think that the impacts or are as significant as they say they are, or we don't think this happens as much as they say they are. And so what you've done is that at best you've flipped the argument, at least you've or at least you've like neutralized it, or you've made it less significant. And if you do each, there's a good chance the judge buys like at least one or two, and so you're able to get something to stick on their argument. And it's also just a good depth of rebuttal also makes it harder for them to kind of come back at you. So this brings me to the first drill that I want you guys to do. So as you can see, there is one argument each for prop and op on the motion this house would implement a maximum wage. What I want you guys to do is come up with a flip, neutralization, and mitigation for each argument, and then deliver the responses using the structure that I've just discussed. If you want, you can pause this video, go back and look at the structure again, but I want you to look at the prop and op arguments and come up with those three responses and then deliver them. So like I just said earlier, this is the argument, first flip, even if that. I want you to use that to come up with the responses. And don't forget what separates response from rebuttal. Why does this matter in the round? Obviously, because it's not a full round, you can't really do the why does this matter in the round as a whole, but I want you to focus on explaining, or not focus, but I want you to explain why what you're saying takes down their argument and why it's so important in relation to their argument. That's a very important part of rebuttal that I want you guys to get. So pause this video, do the drill, and then come back to this. Next, then on some more types of rebuttal. Yeah, so hopefully you guys have done that drill by now. I would say that this drill is good to kind of get the basics down, but I'll give you guys a drill at the end that I think is worth repeating because of how useful I think it is for developing your skills at rebuttal. So then on the next types of rebuttal, I think this fall into kind of three categories. First one is calling out logical gaps in an argument. You'd be surprised how many teams and how many debaters, even at the world schools level, make arguments that just have these really big gaps in the logic, right? Like they assert something or just don't prove something altogether. And if they don't prove that thing, then you can't buy the argument. And I promise you, especially at the beginner level, your opponents will have so many gaps in their speech. And so what I want you guys to do is point out those gaps and then explain why this takes down their argument. So imagine an argument like a Jenga tower, right? If you don't have one of the layers, the argument collapses. And so what I want you to do is that if they haven't proved a mech, explain why the mech means they can't access their impacts. If it's an impact, if they haven't met the impact, then explain why this means the argument is useless. If there's a premise that they haven't explained, explain why that means that everything else just doesn't happen. And then also the going above and beyond bit is then actually explaining why they can't bridge this gap. So let's say they haven't explained why something happens, explain why the thing doesn't happen. Preempt them, say, they haven't done this, but let's be super charitable, assume that they have and show you why it doesn't. That just makes that's kind of like a 2-in-1, right? You're doing the neutralization and you're pointing out the logical gap. But the point is, and this is what you want to flag to the judge, is that like even if we don't say anything, the fact that this gap exists means you can't buy the argument because they haven't done the necessary legwork to do it. And this is a really powerful tool to get some really good hits in. I think this type of rebuttal becomes really important towards the end. And when I say towards the end, I mean in reply, right? Because this is kind of in that gray zone where it's not really rebuttal, it's technically just an observation. So if you frame it as an observation, you could be, look, like a few observations, like they haven't proven this. That's not a rebuttal, you're just pointing out that they haven't proven this. And then like another observation is that, okay, if they haven't proven this, then like it's pretty difficult to buy everything that comes after it. But I think while it's especially important in reply, you can use it throughout. And I would try to point out those logical gaps and press on them wherever possible, because there will be a lot of them. The next one then is on responses to non-utilitarian arguments. So when I say a utilitarian argument, I mean the arguments about how this improves the standards of living, this improves buy-in, this causes social change or whatever. Those are utilitarian arguments. They're based on the idea that we care about things like pleasure and pain, economic growth, practical outcomes. The word that we use for non-utilitarian arguments are principled arguments. Well, utilitarianism is a principle in and of itself, but that's a discussion for another. We'll call them principled arguments for the time being. And I think a very effective way to respond to these non-utilitarian or principled arguments is to do something called burden pushing. And when I say burden pushing, I mean pushing the limits of the principle that they are advocating for and show how the average rational voter cannot buy into this principle. So I'll give an example, right? Of burden pushing. Let's say the motion is that this House would require all 18-year-olds to do 1 year of mandatory national service. Opposition might say that this is principally bad because the government, because this overrides consent, they didn't consent to this, state overreach, etc. A burden push on prop side. So the op argument is basically they didn't consent to this, you cannot force them to do service. So then prop says that okay, this is true. If we concede the if we for the sake of argument agree that that you can't force people to do something, force people to buy into this government program that they didn't agree to. Why should I, for example, pay taxes if I don't agree with the tax regime, if I don't agree with the thing that my money is being used for, right? And you can like take this further. Like taxation is clearly like a more pervasive thing than 1 year of military service. Taxation is a significant amount of your money over an extended period of time. Think about like the quality of life benefits over decades and decades if they didn't have to pay taxes. And so if you say that they can't make them do this thing for 1 year out of their 80-year life, why are they allowed to tax, right? And then you start go on and say like, like the average person probably cannot buy this, that we all agree as a society that like that the government can do this. And so if they're able to do this, why can't they do this lesser thing? And then you say like if the other side wants to defend not forcing people to if they want to defend the position that the government can't force people to do national service, they also have to defend this other bigger, more extreme thing. And they can't do that because no rational individual can buy that. But the way to go one step further is to explain the premise as to why we agree it's okay for the government to do things. Why? So then you talk about like, okay, we think it's okay for the state to force you to go through things like 18 years of education. They force you to abide by the laws and not, for example, go out and kill people. And we allow the state to do these things because we recognize they can mandate us to do things that are beneficial to both us and society. And so this is just an extension of that, right? Like we allow them to, for example, tax us because we know that it's not only beneficial for us because it provides things like the military, it provides things like our education system and our you see and our like roads, but it's beneficial for society as a whole. Everyone benefits when the government is able to take portions of people's income and then use them for welfare and whatnot. And the same thing applies to national service. National service is beneficial for society as a whole. It means that you have labor working for the government, even not just in the military, but also in social services. But then you also it's benefit. But then in this debate, for example, which came up a few months ago, you can then talk about how it's actually beneficial to the individual as well, and that's why we force people to go through education because it's also beneficial to us to go and get educated for 16 to 18 years, depending on where you are. And so that's the premise behind why we buy it. But also intuitively, you appeal to the judge's intuition here and say like you are like the judge is an average rational voter. You as an average rational voter cannot buy into this. And so you can't buy their principle. And that's the idea behind burden pushing. I think this is probably a more effective way to respond to principles compared to the mitigation for neutralization thing, because principles don't really follow that structure. And so our rebuttal should adapt to that new structure as well. The final one then is outweighing an argument with your role. So this is kind of like the last minute kind of like do or die kind of thing, which is like if all else fails, why why do we still kind of win? And this is where you outweigh it, right? So like let's say all the other few responses fail. This is like an even if argument. So even if you buy this argument to the fullest extent, doesn't matter compared to this other thing that we present, and that's weighing, explaining why what you say is more important than what they say if you concede that both are true. I won't go into much depth into weighing or any depth at all into weighing because you'll see more on this in Ved's session dedicated to weighing because it's such an important skill, not just in responses but especially in the third speech. So I would definitely go and watch that if you're interested in that kind of response. Next, this brings us to the next drill, for which should take you about 5 to 10 minutes. And what I want you to do is using the burden push technique, come up with and deliver responses to the following principles on the motion this House would introduce a 100% inheritance tax. Prop could say on this principle that inheritance you should say inheritance is fundamentally unfair and should be abolished via this tax, while op could say that this violates the right to property. So what burden pushes would you use for either of those ones? So yeah, pause this video and come back to it because I'll give you some examples. I'll give you some examples in a second. Okay, so hopefully you guys have now done the drill. And so I'll just give you some examples. So I'll start with the right to property thing. Now, we already um we already like we all for just I'll give an example of the right to property. We already conceded the government is able to seize our property for common welfare, right? Because we do buy into taxation. And so that's a burden push, right? Because like if you say that you have this right to property, why is taxation okay? Like you that's just an example of a burden push. You have to then like we say, like we all agree, taxation is fine. So why is this any different to that? And that's again appealing to the intuition of the judge and then forcing them to kind of take up this position that is kind of difficult, again, kind of difficult to uphold. And then the way that I would deal with prop is to talk about how, well, it's not really about the inheritance, but it's again, like using ops principle, it's about the right to property, right? Like we agree that people are allowed to do what they want with the property. And so then the burden push becomes like, if you think if the government believes that something is fundamentally unfair, are they allowed to seize people's assets entirely and take away their right to property in order to fulfill this goal? And that's a burden push. And then they have to now defend this more extreme kind of principle. And so that's the kind of idea that I wanted you guys to get with burden pushing. Next, then, that's a kind of theory on how and the different strategies that you can use. But I want to switch gears now and talk about the practical approach to rebuttal. So first of all, how do you approach rebuttal during prep? Everyone during prep should absolutely think about the other side's case. So when you're silent prepping and even when you're discussing, something that you guys should bring up and should think about at some point is, what are they going to run, right? Like what are the obvious, big, impactful op or prop lines, depending on who you are, that they're going to bring up? And then the extension of that is, okay, can we write down some broad stroke responses that we can then just write on a piece of paper and then bring up with us when they eventually bring it up? Because that's something you guys should all think about and all contribute to. But I think during prep, the amount that you focus on depends on what speaker role you're doing. So if you're speaker one, obviously you should focus less on the rebuttal and focus more on writing your speech. You will have more to talk about. You have setup, you will presumably have the biggest and most impactful argument. So the onus of working on this doesn't really fall on you. It falls on your teammates. This brings me to speaker 2 and 3. For you guys, I would focus on writing down fleshed out responses to key ideas that they're likely to run and responses to their responses to your arguments. So again, when you have arguments, think about, okay, what are the key weaknesses here? What angles are they going to attack this from? And then how can we preempt those angles and come up with responses to their responses? But then the bonus of this is then you can embed these preemptions to make your argument stronger. But the point is I want you guys to really focus, especially towards the end of prep, on what the other side is going to say and write down responses. That way, when your first op or your second prop or so on, and you have to go up, you have something pre-prepared that you've all been able to contribute to and you've all been able to spend time writing. And then the non-speaking members, now obviously, depending on what kind of a member you are, what strengths you bring, you will have different roles. So for example, one of the non-speaking members might be helping speaker one. And so in that case, maybe you want to focus on writing. But for those of you who are focusing on speaker 2 and 3, who are designated to write POIs or whatever, you should assist wherever possible in ideation and writing. It should be in the back of your head when you're doing whatever is your assigned task. And then go back to speaker 2 and 3, say, hey, like I have this idea, maybe we should consider responding to it, or I have this response that I think we should preempt. And I think it's important that all of you are really cognizant of what the other side is going to say, so that when you go into the round, you're not blindsided and the burden doesn't fall onto the next speaker all by themselves in 60 seconds to respond to this big idea that you could have preempted. During the round, then, during the round, you also have to be thinking about rebuttal pretty actively. So for everyone, it is absolutely imperative that you guys track. You need to stay attentive and you just can't let anything slip through the cracks. If one of you or all of you aren't actively writing down the things that they are saying, because in the heat of battle, you guys will forget what they were talking about, and you're because you've forgotten, you're not going to be able to come back later and respond to that thing. And so it's absolutely really important that you guys are actively tracking during the round, and you make sure that you're responding to all of the big ideas. Speaker one, then. If you're proposition, then obviously no responses because you have nothing to respond to. But if you're op, what I would say is you should respond to the key premises only, and you shouldn't spend longer than 2 minutes on rebuttal. Because even if you're first op, your primary obligations are to set up the debate from op side, and also to present what is probably going to be your most important argument in the round. And so what I would focus on is responding to key things that will impact the rest of the debate going forward. So respond to characterization that you disagree with. Respond to, like, obviously in broad strokes, the key argument that they've presented. But I would say supply the next, give the big burden of responses to your next speaker. That's fine. I want you to be able to focus on the other things that are obviously more important in your speech. After your speech is done, and this applies to both prop and op speaker one, continue to track diligently and supply the next speakers with rebuttals. They're obviously going to be overwhelmed. You don't have to speak, so you can help them. Say, look, I'll respond to this thing that they said. Write a response, hand it over to them. Obviously, ask POIs as well, but try to do both things at once. Track and help with responses so that you alleviate the burden of your next two speakers and they're able to cover everything within the time that they're given. If you're speaker two, you're responsible for a bulk of the responsive work. And so a good rule of thumb is to spend roughly half of your speech on responding to what has happened in the debate already. Now, lately in the world school circuit, it's become acceptable to spend 8 minutes responding. I think speaker two of side proposition in the 2024 WCC finals did just do a full 8 minute responsive speech. So clearly it's becoming more common. But if you're not confident in that, for a 4-4 split between responses and argument is probably the optimal one, just from a strategic perspective, but also in the judge's eyes, because judges are kind of looking for you to follow that structure. And so I want you to spend 4 minutes then doing the bulk of the responses work, which means responding to not only the speaker before you, but the things that have happened in the debate so far that your first speaker probably hasn't been able to get a chance to respond to yet. And if your second prop, you have a big burden because the person before you has just laid out the most important parts of the op case. And so you will definitely have enough to respond to. If your second prop, then if your second op, then the prop team has just got their first chance to throw their swings at you. And so now you get a chance to kind of rebuild your case through responses. Again, track, help your teammates throughout. You don't want anything to slip through the cracks. You want to alleviate the burden on the next speaker as much as possible. If you're third, I would say that it's different than second, in which your primary job or your only job is not to just throw out like lots of new responses. It's to balance new responses with your other responsibilities. So when I say by new responses, I think I'm talking about two things. One, you want to tie up the loose ends, right? So maybe a response that your previous speaker wasn't able to get to, or something you guys have been neglecting in the round. Absolutely, go for that. Respond to it. And also, obviously, if there's a speaker who's come right before you, respond to the material because no one's got a chance to respond to that. That's absolutely fine. But don't lose track of explaining why you've won the debate as a whole. Remember to bring back everything that's happened in the round and balance rebuttal with the kind of summary, with the clashes, with previous responses that have already been given. All of those things are important to your speaker role as well. With reply, absolutely nothing new. Like it's a very hard bright line that reply speakers cannot bring new rebuttals. You can bring back rebuttals that have been said already, add at most maybe a new example to it, but bring them back and obviously explain why they're important. You're allowed to do that. Again, with the burden, with the logical gaps thing, if you frame it very, cunningly as, oh, it's an observation, then yeah, sure, but don't bring in new responses. That role belongs to the previous speakers before you. You will not be credited for that content if it's new. Focus on bringing back what's already been said and strategic observation slash burden pushing, logical gaps. Then on quite a few pieces of strategy, actually. Firstly is choose what to respond to wisely, and you really don't need to respond to everything. For example, If the speaker before you starts an argument at 7:45, you don't need to respond to that. You really don't. Like that's not something that matters in the round. They haven't mechanized it. It's just a statement really that they've thrown out. So if you really, really want to respond to it, it should be like a line or two max and focus on the things that they have developed, focus on the things that are clearly important in the round. Again, if it's like a one line like example or mech or something, don't bother. Don't bother. That's not worth your time. Focus on the big ideas and the key ideas that really will make a difference in the round. If this isn't a round winning thing or a round altering thing, then don't bother. You can that's fine. You're not expected to respond to absolutely everything. You're expected to respond to the things that matter. Prioritize. Within the things that you choose to respond to, there are things that will matter more, things that will matter less. For example, there will be a clash that might be clearly more important in the round because both sides have just spent so much more time on it. Clearly, the impacts are more substantial on that side to the point where that clash outweighs whatever comes next. And so spend time on that. Start with that. Start with it. Spend the bulk of your responses time on that. I spend a majority of responsive time on that because that's what's going to matter eventually in the round. And so you just want to kind of be very cunning with how you use your limited time in order to maximize the effect on the broader round. Next, then, is don't get carried away, right? Like it's important to have hard time limits on your responses. A great way to do this is when you're writing your speech, write timestamps. So, okay, I'm going to respond. I'm going to do this response for 1 minute, this response for 1 minute. By the time it's 4 minutes, I need to move on to whatever's next. You need to do that, right? Because if you get carried away, you're not going to be able to fulfill your other obligations. Whether if you're first, then you might need to give your argument. If you're second, you might need to give an argument. You might need to take a POI. So you need to be cognizant of those things. And if you aren't able to cover everything, that's fine. Pass it on to the next person, especially if you're first. If you're first, it's absolutely okay to just pass it on to the next person. I want you to be able to spend your the appropriate amount of time on the other important things in the round. That is to minimize repetition. I see all too often, for example, people will give a rebuttal and then the rebuttal comes up back in their argument. They give a rebuttal and then clearly their framing response to the whatever's there. So first of all, that's that, right? If you're able to integrate it wherever possible, do it. Integrate it into clashes, arguments, whatever. So you're not repeating yourself at the beginning and at the end or beginning or the middle of your speech. Try to combine things, combine responses with other parts of your speech wherever possible. For example, in an argument, if there's a mech that responds to something, second mech and note how this responds to their thing on that and then just say the mech. Like that's one way to do it. In your clashes, when you're talking about we said this, they said this, again, when you say they said this, few new responses, and that's how you integrate rebuttals into that. But also group responses together wherever possible. If you're responding to the one argument and there are lots of responses, group them together. If you're responding to a theme of things, group them together. That way you're just making sure that you don't minimize that you're not responding to the same thing multiple times. And it also means that the train of thought is clearer. So if you have one response to a theme, but then a response from the same theme is down here, if you're just able to group them together, it just makes the picture a bit clearer in the judge's head. Next is to be charitable, and this is so important because I've heard all too many times judges say, I needed you guys to be more charitable in the round. I myself find myself telling debaters, you need to be more charitable in the round. So steelman arguments. Take the best version of the argument. Don't scroll what they've said. Represent what their argument was honestly. Give even if responses, even if you buy this to be true, even in our worst case, even in their best case. Rebut their best case and explain why even in your worst case you're still fine. The response still works. And also make it clear to the judge you're being charitable. Look, I'm being charitable, even if I'm super charitable, even if you need to say these words for them to really appreciate what you're doing. And that will go a long way because when they're giving their OA, they have these extra justifications as to why you won the round. It just really, really makes your case airtight because you don't know whether they're going to take their best case or your best case or their worst case and your worst case. You just want to cover all the bases and be as charitable as possible. And then finally, and this links back to thinking about the other side in prep time. You want to be able, and this applies to like this house would or this house believes that X should Y debates, is you want to preemptively model arguments or rebuttals out of the debate. And a very, very good example of this is the motion this house would impose a voter education test, and the people who pass this education test get double the votes. So many op arguments. Oh, vulnerable to political capture, inaccessible for less educated or poor people. So clearly there are arguments you give for op, but you can model all of these out. Okay, on prop, we model this. We model the education test. It's set by an independent, non-partisan board, even split between people from ideological spectrum. We will set up free education resources, whether it be online, classrooms, etc., etc. And immediately you just mitigated so many of like you've already mitigated their arguments without them having to say it because they're obviously going to say it, but you're just getting that kind of foot up when it comes to responding. Because if you don't do that stuff, then it becomes harder to respond to those things down the line. So that's why it's so important to preempt what they're going to say and see if you can integrate your responses into whatever you're already going to say, whether it be a model or an argument. It saves you time. It makes it easier for you to win the round. Next, and I think this is the final slide, is on rookie mistakes. Um, what I just want to cover things that I have seen debaters do kind of all too often in rounds that have made their rebuttals seem kind of worse quality and have just made them less impactful for me in the round. Firstly, is going into insufficient depth. Rebuttals and arguments may be labeled differently, but rebuttals are really just mini arguments. And just like how you're expected to develop your arguments, because if you don't, they're going to be like, oh, you didn't prove it, insufficient mech, whatever. It's the same with rebuttals. You have to explain if you're neutralizing something, why your neutralization is true. If you're impacting something, why is that impact true? You need to do that as well. Because if you don't, then it's difficult to buy into. And the best responses are the well-developed ones. Because if you spend a minute or two responding to something in depth, explaining to me in depth, giving me multiple reasons, that is a more convincing response than a one-liner that I see all too often. So try to extend your response beyond a single line. And this kind of links to the next one, which is whataboutism. And this is very common at the beginner level. What I see is one side will say something, the other side will say, oh, they said this, but what about this? And they bring up uh, an unrelated argument and say, oh, but what about this? Now, unless you're weighing and you're saying, oh, like, okay, we outweigh this with this, which only should be a last resort. This is not an appropriate response, right? Because it doesn't deal with the crux of the argument. You've just brought back an argument that you said earlier without saying how these two things interact. And so you're running a parallel debate. At least by weighing, you explain why one thing is poor illustration, or why one thing is superior to another, or why, if you're doing another type of response, why that other argument doesn't work in the debate altogether. So it's important not to engage in whataboutism by just bringing back another thing that you said. Make sure you're directly engaging with the core of what they are talking about. Then just other mistakes that I've already kind of covered in this lecture. All too often, I make this mistake as well. Difference between response and rebuttal. The responses could be excellent if you don't explain why they matter in the context of the argument, in the context of the wider debate. It's not as useful. If you're repeating things and you're just wasting your own time that could have been spent on responding to different things or giving me new responses. And so try to minimize the repetition. But also, if you're repeating something you've already said, it's just less engaging for the judge. You don't want to kind of lose their attention. But I also all too often see missing responses altogether. And again, I'm also prone to this. Team UAE, we also make these mistakes, and so really they shouldn't be rookie mistakes. They're just mistakes that are really big and happen all too often, but will really undermine the quality of responses. And so you need to make sure that you're responding to all the big things that could move the needle in the debate. A key argument, a key impact, a key piece of weighing that they've given, a key response to your argument. You need to make sure that you're covering all these bases. And that's why tracking is so important. Because if you aren't tracking the debate properly, you're not going to remember the important thing they said up in first that's worth bringing back and explaining why it doesn't matter in the round. So it's important to track properly so that you are covering all those bases. Otherwise, you're leaving yourself vulnerable to a pathway for the judge to give them the win. You want to minimize that margin of error as much as possible and cover all your bases. So this brings me to the end of the content and to the final drill that I want you guys to do. And I want to note something about the drill. If there's one thing you take from this session, I want it to be this drill. I want you to go and not do this just once, but multiple times. If you're really serious about developing your ability to not only track, but also to respond, you should really do this drill. And so I would recommend this to anyone, regardless of whether you're first or you're a third, because the skills that you will pick up here will be useful somewhere. So what I want you to do is go to YouTube, search up WSDC, and just pick a round. Ideally, a recent one, because obviously the style and things have changed over time. So just pick a recent one. And before you watch the round, so find the motion. The motion will generally be in the bio. If it's not, you can always just go to the tab. So search up the competition, find the tab, find what motion it is, and then spend 15 minutes preempting the prop case. So spend 15 minutes, figure out what the arguments are, figure out what the responses are. If you want, you can spend 20 even. Try 20 minutes. Then I want you to watch the first prop speech. So in this case, you would be up. Watch the first prop speech and track the speech as a whole as diligently as you can. So make sure you're getting all the key ideas, all the key points of framing, etc. Get it down, and keep in mind throughout this that you will respond to the speech right afterwards. So it's like if you were in a debate, if second prop was speaking and you're second op, you're writing these things down, keeping in the back of your mind that I'm going to have to respond to these things in 60 seconds. So then, once the speech ends, take about 60 seconds and then deliver your responses using the structure I discussed at the beginning. And for the sake of this drill, I would say try to aim for about 4 minutes. If you're a first speaker, then you're not gonna do for 4 minutes in practice. If you're a third speaker, you're gonna integrate it throughout, so it's not gonna be like 4 minutes that you can like extract into one block. But if you're second, it obviously works. But the reason why I say 4 minutes is so that you're able to cover all the bases and kind of develop that responsive skill so that you can then apply it to whatever speaker role you're doing. If you're one, you can cut the responses. If you're three, you can integrate the responses. If you're second, then you can just take the responses as it is. But I think this is generally very useful. And then again, speaking for 4 minutes forces you to go into that depth, forces you to cover all the bases. So I think it's good practice for world schools where you will be speaking in such depth. But yeah, that brings me to the end of the drill. To the end of the lecture. I hope this was helpful. Again, if there's one thing you take, please take this drill and practice it. It'll really help you. And yeah, I would again highly recommend you guys to watch the other lectures. I think obviously the lecturers are just amazing, and the stuff that they have to teach you will benefit you in some way or the other, regardless of what speaker role you are, because it's at the end of it is a team competition. But yeah, good luck with all of your debating endeavors, and I hope to see you at a competition sometime.